beautiful humans, and welcome to the Double Blind Magic Hour, where we cover what's going on in the world of psychedelics, from insider baseball drama within the rapidly unfolding psychedelic movement to the latest news on research, politics, and beyond. We're here to talk with the most brilliant minds we know from the psychedelic frontier about the popularization of shrooms, acid, DMT, you name it. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Shelby Hartman, co-founder of Double Blind, a print magazine covering psychedelics, and today we're joined by a regular contributor to the magazine and one of the most incredible journalists that I know. I'm not just saying that. Her name is Michelle Lhooq. Hey, Michelle.
Hey, Shelby. Thanks for having me on.
I just have so much to say about you and your career and how much I love you as a human and as a writer.
Aww.
But why don't you tell people a little bit about how you got to be here?
Well, I'd love to take it all the way back to my childhood. I was born and mostly raised in Singapore, which has one of the strictest drug laws in the world. Psychedelics and all forms of drugs are pretty much penalized with the death penalty or really long stints in prison. So I grew up under extreme prohibition. And I think that as a result, just became really obsessed with drugs. Especially once I started actually doing them when I, moved to America for college, and I realized that a lot of what I'd grown up with was total bullshit. So, I became really interested in the underground culture of drugs. My entryway was specifically through a lot of music and nightlife and underground rave culture in particular. I found raving to be extremely liberatory as a practice and helping me to uncover other aspects of my identity that perhaps had been repressed. And when I heard that California was legalizing weed in 2017, it blew my mind that a government could get behind, the propagation of this plant that I was really, really into. Like weed was, like many people, one of my gateways into psychedelics. So I moved to California in 2017. I wrote a book that was kind of like a illustrated guide to cannabis culture for the 21st century. I was particularly interested in all the ways that weed was changing under legalization. So, I talked about weed parties and weed sommeliers, and weed sex parties and all of these different aspects of the culture that were really blooming. And I learned so much about weed through going to weed parties. And eventually I started throwing my own. So weed definitely, like I said, really changed my life in some ways. I would say that before moving to California, when I was working in New York as a music journalist, I was partying really hard and living one of my best lives, but I was also quite addicted to a number of substances. So, moving to California, I wrote this essay about going California sober that really, really blew up and, helped to popularize the term. And that became a huge part of my relationship to psychedelics as well. I began to see them as forms of harm reduction, I suppose you could say. But I don't like to use the phrase harm reduction too much because I think it really emphasizes harm. Whereas I found that psychedelics were so beautiful in opening me up to a different way to relate to my body and my spirituality through drugs. And so anyway, that's a really long-winded way of saying that, like, through weed and reporting on weed, I, like many, many people, was led to psychedelics, and I saw psychedelics as a really hopeful place, I would say, when I first entered the field. I started throwing mushroom parties. I started reporting more on the industry for your publication and others. And I would say that over the years, like, my initial perhaps idealism has faded a little bit as I've gotten closer and closer to, like, the belly of the beast. But I still believe so much in the culture and especially the underground of psychedelics. And that's a huge part of, like, what motivates me to organize my own social gatherings where, we prioritize mushrooms and psychedelic use over alcohol and other substances, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But yeah, this is where I'm at now, still searching for answers, still exploring what I think is a really multi-layered world. But I would say with a little bit more, perhaps, of a cynicism or maybe even disillusionment or yearning that I maybe didn't have, when I was a teenager or even in my early 20s, thinking about how amazing the world would be if these drugs could be legalized for everyone. And now I'm not so sure, but I think that we're in a very interesting place nonetheless.
Yeah, I love that you temper the enthusiasm and you always bring an air of criticism as well. I said this in our last conversation with a journalist, that people sometimes think double blind is here to just rah psychedelics. Everyone should be doing psychedelics. And actually, as journalists, we're here to look at the good and the bad and the ugly. And you certainly do that. And I love too that you're transparent about the fact that you yourself are on this journey and that you don't have the answers. You're still looking for them, because what we saw in weed and what we are seeing in psychedelics too is a lot of evangelists who are just talking about, the transformative potential of these medicines. And when you start looking really closely at the psychedelic community, people who are standing up on stages saying we should legalize psychedelics, you realize that the reality is not that simple, and that a person can have a profound and therapeutic relationship with psychedelics and also be suffering, and also still be actively trying to figure out what it is that they want to do with their life or the meaning of life, or be grappling with these existential questions that people often come to psychedelics with. And there's this idea that you're going to do a psychedelic and all your problems are going to go away. And no, usually what happens when someone does a psychedelic is they say, I need to keep doing psychedelics. And then they do for many, many, many years. And, decades later, they find that, they have a relationship with these substances that is inextricably intertwined with who they are. And simultaneously, they don't have it all figured out.
Yeah, I think that myself and so many other people just want to be told what to do.
I want to be told what to do.
I feel like we look to these substances for answers and we kind of almost regress to this childlike state where we're just like, Mommy, Daddy, tell me what I need to do to be happy. And life is so much more complicated than that. And I find that the more psychedelics I do, the more questions I have. But what's really beautiful about it, though, is that so many times messages come through that tell me that maybe I'm not going to achieve all the career goals and all of the money goals that I have in my life. But it reminds me this is almost so cliche. I don't want to even say it, but I heard a song recently where one of the refrains is, and the body just asks for love. And I thought that line resonated with me so much because that is often the message that comes through when I trip. And I think it's deeper than it seems. And so much of psychedelic use redirects my attention, I would say, to these sorts of messages about loving my body, what that really means, and caring for myself and caring for the people around me, rather than this sort of careerist, business driven, ego driven path that, I'm usually so intertwined in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I often say I go into psychedelic experiences with questions and I come out realizing my questions were too small. And so you might, we get caught up in our day-to-day lives around, this thing, that thing that, it might be something, you might be annoyed at something at work or something in your relationship or, and I don't want to diminish anything anyone's going through at any particular moment. But I think a lot of times the things that the stressors we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, in hindsight, were not as important as we thought they were. Or maybe we were supposed to be asking different questions, or maybe we were supposed to be asking deeper questions. So I like this idea of it's redirecting your attention. Sometimes you come in and you say, I want to know how I can get to the next place in my career. And what the mushrooms quietly whisper to you is sleep, sleep, drink water, sleep. Just something that seems like so fundamental that you're like, gee, thanks. My mind's blown. But like, is actually deeply profound, or can be. Anyway, we have so much to talk about in regards to all the amazing stories that you've reported for Double Blind. I can't wait to get into it. But first, we're going to take a quick break. This episode of the Double Blind Magic Hour is sponsored by Fungi. Fungi chocolates and fruit chews are an alcohol and psychedelic alternative activated with Kanna. They're perfect for the newly sober or for people that are interested in trying a psychedelic adjacent plant. At Double Blind, we're very passionate about the fact that there's a lot of romanticization of these bigger psychedelics, these scheduled substances, whether it's MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, but there's actually a whole apothecary of legal plants and fungi that come from the earth that are beautiful for connecting with yourself, connecting with other people. I've tried Fungi's chocolates. I did them the other day in the backyard with my friend. It was just the kind of gentle stimulant and euphoria that I was looking for. In addition to the Kanna, the Fungi chocolates have cordyceps, aphrodisiacs such as damiana, and a gentle stimulant to activate the experience, which is called guarana. The Fungi fruit chews are dosed at half of a chocolate serving, giving you more flexibility in how you build your dosage. So strength-wise, 2 of their fruit chews equals 1 chocolate triangle. I had 1 chocolate triangle the other day. With Kanna, they're able to provide a sort of similar instant magical effect to psychedelics. You can kind of think of it like a microdose of MDMA. Kanna also pairs well with other substances such as mushrooms, cannabis, caffeine. If you want to check out Fungi's Kanna chocolates, then you can get 25% off of your first order. Just use the code DoubleBlindPod at fungi.com. That's FUNGUY. I can spell.com. Thanks for listening. So for those of you who don't know, Double Blind began as a print magazine, and it's still at the heart of what we do. I spent my whole career as a journalist before starting Double Blind, reporting on psychedelics, cannabis, and drug policy more broadly for Rolling Stone, Vice, LA Weekly, Quartz. I did just about everything in journalism. I worked at CBS News, covering breaking news, a major newspaper, small media startups, and if you haven't heard, journalism is in crisis. But we started Double Blind anyway because we believe in the value of good journalism to educate and hold stakeholders accountable. We saw what happened in cannabis. Pioneers who put their lives on the line to get patients access to the medicine they needed, getting left behind because they didn't have the capital to compete in the newly regulated market. We've seen what's happened in mental health care and healthcare more broadly, whereby millions of people are suffering, don't trust their doctors, can't afford proper care, and just don't know what to do to get well. In our print magazine, we feature essays, investigations, photojournalism, and much more by world-class journalists who are going everywhere from the ayahuasca tourism industry in Peru to laboratories at leading universities. We're supporting people like you on their journey with psychedelics, and we're covering this movement as it unfolds. This is all made possible by our members who, in exchange for their support, get direct access to psychedelic experts to help them on their journeys of healing and growth, workshops, and a subscription to our beautiful print magazine. Subscribe today at doubleblindmag.com/membership. So first up, I want to talk about a story that you reported for us last June because it is still completely relevant today. The story was called, quote, "The psychedelic industry grew too fast and is now imploding." So it's a pretty sexy headline, but I don't think it's a hyperbolic one. For some context, the story is basically about all of the psychedelic companies that are going under and or went public too soon. And I remember we started talking about this story early last year when there were a few big companies that basically shuttered in what seemed like overnight. So one of these companies was Field Trip Health, which was doing a number of things, but mostly known for opening these pretty ritzy ketamine clinics across the United States. I think you went to one of them, right? And yeah, that, you know, it really felt like sort of a boutique physician's office, or like a concierge physician, or like a meets spa kind of environment. So they were opening clinics across the United States and Canada and shut down, you know, kind of sort of unexpectedly. And then Synthesis at the same time, around the same time, which was most known for originally being a retreat center in the Netherlands, which was doing ceremonies with magic mushroom truffles, also basically left a bunch of students in a lurch after enrolling them in a training to become licensed facilitators in the state of Oregon. And then it's unclear what happened, if they ran out of money or if it was just operationally not going well. I do want to just give a shout out to Retreat Guru, which is a company that offers psychedelic retreats, because they did end up stepping in and making sure that those students got what they paid for. And now Synthesis seems to be operating again. I don't know exactly what's going on there, but really, like, this was just the beginning of a trend that a lot of investors predicted a few years ago, when there was all of this hype around psychedelics is the new cannabis, and all these people were coming in and starting businesses, and it felt like there were maybe half a dozen psychedelic drug development companies and a few places that people really trusted to go to for clinics and retreats. And then all of a sudden it was like every day I was getting a press release about, you know, Mind, like all the companies have the names like Mind or Heart or Psyche or Psyched, you know, is developing blah, blah compound we've never heard of for blah, blah indication, LSD-like compound being developed for anorexia. And you're like, who is doing what? Where? Anyway, I'm kind of rambling, but tell us more about this story.
Yeah, so I was really interested in this idea that a psychedelic bubble was about to burst, that there was a hype inflation around the industry that the research and the companies and the products could not uphold. And all of the evidence seemed to indicate that the bubble was starting to pop, with all of these companies that had gotten so much press and so much positive attention over the last few years that they almost seemed like Goliaths who could never fail, because they were getting millions of dollars of investments. And all of a sudden they were, you know, laying off 30% of their staff and burning through all of their cash runways and shutting down overnight. And it just seemed almost like apocalyptic in the industry suddenly, right? And what was so interesting to me is that all of this implosion was happening at a time when it felt like the public was more excited about psychedelics than ever. And every time a company made the headlines for going bankrupt or laying off its staff, 10 people would be in my inbox asking me where they could get mushrooms. So I felt like at the same time, there was this sort of mismatch or imbalance between public expectations and what was happening in the industry amongst companies that most of my friends had never heard of, but everyone in the psychedelic industry knew. So I kind of jumped into this by first starting to try and trace when the hype bubble began to inflate, which I think you can kind of pinpoint to around 2018, which is when the FDA declared psilocybin a breakthrough therapy for depression. And shortly after that, in 2019, the FDA also approved esketamine, or Spravato, for depression. And I think that there's something about the FDA approving these medicines that really helped psychedelics hit a huge mainstream moment in the collective consciousness, because it's like, oh, the government says it's okay. And then, of course, once that happened, all of the biggest legacy media sites like the New York Times were reporting on psychedelics as the hottest new therapeutic since Prozac, and really positioning them as breakthrough medicines for conditions that science has not really figured out how to cure. So following all of this press, you started seeing a lot of biotech companies come in with multiple billions of dollars of investments. And like you said, all of these ketamine clinics sprouting up that looked like luxury spas or, elite concierges for Upper East Side moms who are doing ketamine IV drips alongside their Botox treatments. And it's unreal. I mean, it's completely insane, especially for anyone who might have been, like me, experimenting with ketamine for much longer and going to raves and seeing, this complete rebranding of ketamine from being kind of scary, weird rave drug that everybody thinks of as the horse tranquilizer to a luxury wellness product. And it happened so quickly. And I think the pandemic was also a huge part of these ketamine clinics being able to sprout up like this, because a lot of them were taking advantage of lax laws around telehealth that happened. So that was another thread in the story, is how a lot of these clinics were, operating through legal loopholes. They were prescribing the drug off label. So ketamine is typically used for surgery, but they were prescribing it for depression and anxiety off label. And they were using telehealth to prescribe it to patients that often they'd never even met in person. And so these drugs were getting disseminated to, upper middle class Americans that previously would have had to go to street dealers, and they would never have done that. So you start to see the sort of rampant destigmatization as well as commoditization of ketamine in the wellness and, mental health spaces instead of the underground rave and drug spaces.
I've never really thought about the journey of ketamine from underground rave culture to luxury clinic and how that trajectory sort of it lays forth a potential trajectory for other medicines too. But ketamine is a particularly interesting one because we're going to talk about this more when we get to your story about ketamine lozenges and get more into these telehealth companies. But it's a particularly interesting one because it doesn't have a history of sort of indigenous ancestral plant medicine ceremonial use. Like it was sort of abused in the underground from the get-go. Yeah. And now it is obviously being prescribed for therapeutic purposes, and sometimes in these medical buildings, with nurse practitioners and all the rest, but also sometimes at these kind of medical spas where, they're doing the Botox and the eyebrow threading and the fillers and the, I don't know what all they offer there. I have no interest in going to a place like that, but, I also want to chime in here and provide some context to our listeners, because when we talk about companies within psychedelics, there are a lot of different types of companies in psychedelics, and a few of them were in Michelle's story. So there are ketamine clinics like the ones we've been talking about that, are primarily providing ketamine via IV and IM for people with mental health conditions. And my understanding is that a clinic is a very hard model. It's very hard to make money as a clinic, but that a lot of these clinics are opening up because they hope, and this was Field Trip's hope, they're sort of banking on the fact that they're going to be able to introduce psilocybin, MDMA, and other psychedelics into their clinic when those things become legalized as therapeutic treatments, right? So they're sort of like waiting with bated breath for the legalization of these additional compounds. And they're hoping that by having the clinic and the staff and the everything like that in place already, that it's going to kind of enable them to be first to market. But then there's also what we sort of were referencing, which are these drug development companies. And that's a whole other beast. It costs about $350 million on average to bring a drug to market. And, yeah, the hype around the drug development companies, I mean, that's a whole other thing. Basically, I was speaking to Hamilton Morris, who a lot of people probably know from his show on Vice called Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, about all these drug development companies. And he said to me, you really have to look at how many of them are preclinical. How many of them, basically, how many of these compounds have never even been put into a human, to understand how early the conceiving of a lot of these compounds is and how far they have to go to actually get to market. So they're going and they're raising hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars for a compound that may never even make it out of animals into humans. So it's just a lot of, yeah. Anyway, so if you see a press, yeah, it's just kind of crazy. Anyway, I'm going to stop there.
Well, I think that's a great place to kind of pick up the thread, because biotech companies, and I think Hamilton works for one of them now, doesn't he?
Oh, he does. Yeah, now he's a consultant. Now he works for Compass, which is a whole other conversation. Yeah, anyway.
But yeah, biotech companies have been investing into the psychedelic space in almost mind-boggling numbers. And I think that a huge part of this hype bubble, so-called, was that these investors from other spaces were coming in and taking advantage of the huge growth mindset of the time. And there was this sort of mentality that risky behavior would be rewarded. There was an anticipation that the legalization of MDMA, for example, would happen like yesterday. But the timeline keeps getting pushed back. And so I think a lot of these companies are realizing like, oh, fuck, we're running out of our cash runway. And the legalization process is actually way more complicated, and it's not going to happen that quickly. And so what I was hearing while talking to investors and people who've been in this space for a long time is that they were seeing, any company with like a mushroom in their deck get funding. And all of a sudden, with the entire biotech industry going into a downturn, which it has been over the last few years because of, complex economic factors, including fears of a recession. A lot of companies were going bust. And interestingly, I think some investors actually thought that this was a good thing, that some of these huge companies, as well as smaller startups, were all kind of cutting back or shutting down or going into debt restructuring, because they thought it was a market correction, and that it was, maybe punishing or teaching some of these companies to come up with real business plans instead of just riding the hype roller coaster. So it was funny, because a lot of these investors would say, I'm good because I've done my research, but all the people who haven't, they got it too easy. But our company, you should invest in us because we have clear business ideas. But I do think there is something to this idea of a hype cycle. There is a really interesting chart that you can look up if you Google Gartner hype cycle. It was this idea invented by a female marketing analyst in 1995 named Jackie Fenn. And it's this idea that as expectations rise, the media kind of comes in and they position this technology or whatever innovation it is to be more efficient or more capable than what it's actually able to deliver. And so inevitably, there will be a crash where there is this sort of trough of disillusionment. And that causes a market correction where companies go bust, a lot of bad press happens, but then eventually expectations meet where that technology is actually at, and things kind of even out in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. I really appreciate that you're bringing up this concept of hype, because the way that you're framing it is making me think not only about the perhaps disproportionate hype around the prospect of psychedelics being this amazing business opportunity and investment opportunity, but also the perhaps disproportionate hype around the potential of psychedelics themselves. And that actually does intersect with what's happening at these drug development companies. There are really big ethical questions about the degree to which psychedelics do what people think they do.
Right.
And that's really, to me, is kind of the elephant in the room when we're talking about the hype. As we know, MDMA is, very close, as far as we can tell, probably the next year to certainly the next 3 years, to being approved for post-traumatic stress disorder. Psilocybin is fairly close to being approved for treatment-resistant depression and or major depressive disorder. So those are the compounds that we really see have made meaningful progress through the FDA approval process. And we don't have very much research looking at the long-term effects of these substances. So someone could have a psychedelic experience and emerge, and within the week, within months, even a year or 2 years later, could report that it's a deeply meaningful experience. But does that mean that 10 years from now, they still are not experiencing acute effects of trauma? They still are not depressed? They haven't gone back to their old ways of being? As mentioned, it's even kind of hard to do anecdotal research on this because in the real world, a lot of people who do psychedelics don't just do them once. So yeah, that's something that we really need to be talking about.
Yeah. And I think that the media has a huge responsibility here that in some ways has failed. I think the media has failed the public in some ways when it comes to checking the hype cycle. I think that in that period of like 2018 to now, there's been several waves of media coverage of psychedelics, but I think especially in the 2018 to 2019 period, so much of the press was overwhelmingly positive, and it was positioning these drugs as miracles. And I think there was this idea maybe amongst the psychedelic media that if you said anything negative, that you would derail the momentum that the movement has been working on for so long. And so, everybody was kind of caught up in the excitement of, oh my God, these substances are finally getting the public recognition from the authorities and from the mass, from the mass audience that they deserve. But as a result, I think now there's a backlash because, first of all, scientists are saying, hold on, all of this hype is actually impeding our abilities to do our research objectively. And then also you start hearing all of these stories of, therapist abuse, of patients becoming even more suicidal, and all of the complications and the shadow side, whatever you want to call it, of psychedelics are coming out. And then the public feels cheated. So it's interesting now that I'm seeing more journalists enter the psychedelic media landscape who are not from the psychedelic world. Often these people have never even done drugs before. And that's a whole other can of worms that I don't really want to open up because that becomes media analysis. But these are very different types of journalists. And a lot of them are much more critical of psychedelics, both in use as well as the industry and the practice of it. But like I said, I'm a little conflicted because a lot of these journalists have also never tried psychedelics in their lives. So I think that there's a lot more room for the psychedelic media landscape to grow. And that more criticism is definitely a great thing. But I would also love to see more people who have really deep experiences with drugs from not just the therapeutic side, but from the underground and the recreational side join the conversation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you know, the reason double blind exists is because we felt like there needed to be more nuance. We were seeing these psychedelic outlets that people in the psychedelic industry read that were talking about ethics and indigenous use and the potential shortcomings of psychedelic research. And then we had outlets like Rolling Stone and Vice that were, and at least back in 2018, they'd done some nuanced stories, but I want to say there was a need for more nuanced stories about what was happening within the field of psychedelics that kind of mainstream audiences were having access to. We're seeing more and more of it, but there's still a big need. And part of that is sort of disrupting a systemic issue within journalism, whereby we're always looking for a really sexy story. And the sexy story is veteran, what had acute PTSD. They went to the Amazon, they did ayahuasca, and now they're completely healed and their life is transformed. We see a lot of stories about that. And I'm not diminishing the fact that some people truly do go and have a psychedelic experience and find that their life is profoundly changed for the better right away. But there's way, way, way more people that are somewhere in between. I did a psychedelic once and my whole life transformed for the better. And I did a psychedelic once and I wish I hadn't, or I'm worse off for it. There's a lot of people in the middle there who have maybe some things got better, maybe some things got harder, maybe they, whatever. I mean, there's every type of story under the sun exists. And because every journey for every single person is different always. And how do we find the space to talk about all of it and to hold all of it? So next up, we're going to get into the heart of what you like to write and talk about, which I don't want to reduce what you like to talk about because it's about a lot more than this. But the way that I sometimes think about it is drugs and having a good time. We're going to talk about Shroom Rave, which is an event concept that you pioneered last year and built upon with Double Blind. And we're also going to talk about why you care so deeply about reporting on the psychedelic underground and rave culture. But first, we're going to take a quick break. This episode is brought to you by Psyched Wellness. Psyched Wellness is on a mission to bring people the healing magic of Amanita muscaria mushrooms with their product, Calm. If you haven't heard, there has been a growing number of folks who are exploring the prospect of Amanita muscaria extracts in small doses for anxiety. And Amanita muscaria is not a scheduled substance in the United States, unlike psilocybin. So it's something that more and more people are exploring, getting interested in, and it's something that Psyched Wellness is devoted to. There's some things about Calm specifically that are unique and worth noting. So firstly, it's a natural made supplement made with handpicked Amanita muscaria mushrooms. I'm going to say that's important because there are a lot of supplements where you don't know where they're getting their ingredients. You don't know where they're getting their sources. And so it's really important when you're embarking on a journey of taking a new tincture, taking a new supplement, that you really know that you are purchasing a product that is made with care, made with intention. You know where they're getting their ingredients. Some of the benefits are that this Amanita muscaria extract may promote better sleep and may help you wake up feeling more rested without feeling groggy. It also may provide physical and mental stress support, which is something I know a lot of us are needing at this particular moment. So if you're curious about adding some calm to your life, you can check them out at psyched-wellness.com and use code DOUBLEBLIND for 10% off at checkout. Okay, so now we're going to talk about two stories that you have reported for us on this concept of the Shroom Rave and what it represents to you. So for people who don't know, a Shroom Rave is basically, and I'll let Michelle also tell you what she thinks it is, but basically it's exactly what you think it is. It's a rave where people take shrooms instead of drinking alcohol or essentially getting inebriated without intention or care. And you like to call this holistic hedonism. I love that term. So tell us a little bit about Shroom Rave, what it is, where it began.
Yeah, I mean, Shroom Rave is so connected to my own journey through nightlife. I started out as a music journalist in New York in the 2010s and really was a huge part of, the underground techno and electronic music scene there. And it was such an incredibly enriching playing field to kind of find myself in, because I was getting sensory input and creative inspiration from so many corners of the avant-garde. And it was this melting pot of people and sounds and drugs. And I definitely felt like I spent a lot of time hyper analyzing the different elements of what a rave or social gathering can be, sort of endlessly dissecting and going to so many parties every week to think about, like, what are we doing here? Like, what is this really about? What is it doing for people? What are the different elements that you can put into place or subtract from the equation to create that feeling of transcendence that we're always chasing, which is the feeling of coming outside of yourself and connecting to the hive mind and maybe feeling like you are connected to some higher version of your spirit. And you are allowed to maybe forget about the drudgery of the mundane and of work and of capitalism just for a moment and really remember what it feels like to be alive. This is what I think raving is about. And I think that through my own body and through a lot of kind of risky experimentation, I kind of realized that the best formula for me was to be on what I call a plant-based drug diet, which is cannabis, mushrooms, and other plant-based psychedelics. That somehow this just made the most sense. It felt the most healing. It helped me be my highest self. It helped me to dissociate in the right ways, but not in the wrong ways. It allowed me to be present. And so when I moved to California to basically get sober from a lot of the substances that were more destructive to me, specifically amphetamines, Adderall, cocaine, which were actually, I realized in retrospect, really tied to my desire to be a really productive human being. It's not so much from a place of I'm trying to die, I'm trying to kill myself. This is like the death drive coming out. No, it was actually more of this I need to prove myself mentality. Like, if I'm going to create a career around drugs and raving, which nobody ever told me I could do, especially from the background that I came from, I had to work so hard while also going out every single night and researching the underground. And that led to a pretty debilitating Adderall and cocaine addiction. So I extricated myself from that and started throwing weed rave first. And that was sort of an experiment to see, like, okay, what happens when you put everyone onto the same substance at a party? What does that do just energetically? Are people going to freak out? Are people going to fall asleep? Like, what are people going to look for? How will the music shift? And the experiment was extremely successful. I found like so many people coming out of the woodwork saying, like, I needed this. I need a gentler way to party. I love that we all can like smoke weed together and it becomes this sort of communal ritual. And the artists, I think, were really stimulated by the creative challenge of creating music around a weed experience. And so from there, I started dreaming about a more psychedelic party. And I was really inspired by psychedelic rave culture in the 90s, when a lot of these parties wouldn't serve alcohol and people would just be on a tab or 5 of acid all night. And
no thanks.
These are the scenes, like, I'm thinking of like 90s Detroit, the history of techno and how intertwined it's been with psychedelic use and how some of the best music has come out of these eras. And I wanted to kind of bring it back to that, while also bringing it into the contemporary moment and what specific desires and needs there are now that people need to address. So I was really scared when I threw my first Shroom Rave. I was really afraid that someone would have a bad trip or that people would take too much and I wouldn't know how to deal with it. So it was 2021. It was still very pandemic-y. So I decided to do it outside in the forest here in LA. And I just invited like a handful of people. I literally was like going back and forth in my mind, being like, should I do this? Oh, I'm so scared. Should I do this? Oh, what do I do? And then I woke up one morning and I knew that it was going to be a full moon that night. And I was like, I'm just going to do it. And so I texted a bunch of friends and they brought their friends. We found a sound system somehow and like literally carried it up the mountain into this perfect little grove of trees that I had found. And, we manifested it. And, it was so small and so intimate, but already I felt this really techno-pagan vibe that I had been searching for, sort of creeping out of the soil. And I was like, okay, there's something here. And more importantly, people were so respectful. People were so careful and caring towards each other. It was almost like we were holding on to each other as we danced around the rim of our, subconscious. And so, yeah, I went from there. And the next party that I threw, I decided to remove alcohol completely and just have a couple brands that I trusted bring in product that people could try. And that was a day party. I moved it to the daytime because I really wanted to emphasize this idea of not necessarily being sober in the AA definition, but a sort of orientation towards sobriety, like a flower kind of turning towards the sun. That I kept having that image in mind. It's like sobriety can be like the sun and you turn towards it. And so that sort of orientation also means like microdosing. It also means like experimenting with gentler plant medicines. It also means like really euphoric house music. I decided to really program it around really uplifting sounds. And that was, I think, the party where I felt the dance floor energy really shift. And it felt so clean. It felt so sparkly. It felt so effervescent. And everyone was dancing and looking into each other's eyes and smiling. And yeah, I was just like, wow, this is really wholesome, but it's also really fun. And it's, thank God, not this like productivity oriented, like sober day rave concept that I've seen in other spaces where it's like literally for like working class professionals to like blow off some steam before they hit the office. And like, that's not really the vibe of my party, This is something else. And it was a space that I think I and a lot of people are really searching for. But interestingly, that party, I got some feedback from folks in the psychedelic space, and they told me, while your party had a lot of extroverted energy, we would have loved to have more spaces to go inwards. And that made me realize, oh, wow, like so much of my nightlife exploration has been about exogenous states, like kind of going outwards and connecting and being social and being fabulous. And so that's where a lot of my expertise lies. But like, I've started going inward so much over the last few years through doing high dose psychedelics alone and in other modalities outside of the rave. And I see so much of that too. And I would love to bring that into a rave context and like stretch what the definition of a rave can be. So it was beautiful when you approached me, Shelby, and suggested that we collaborated, because I know that you are someone that goes very deep inwards and has a lot of appreciation for quieter spaces. So, I think that together we came up with this idea of R&R, which stood for, rest and relaxation, but also raving and release. And
ritual and rave.
And ritual and rave. I knew I was missing one more definition. There's so many R's. And we really, brought in breathwork practitioners from the double blind community. We had space
Pop-up
holders.
spa.
We had a little pop-up spa. We had people who were professional trip sitters to create a whole space. I booked DJs that were more from the ambient world, as well as really, really hedonistic, like incredibly psychedelic techno. Like we really had the full spectrum, I want to say, of the experience, including having 2 floors, upstairs being the chill zone and downstairs being our little mushroom kingdom with the giant 15-foot mushroom that we were running around trying to inflate at the very last minute.
I love that you're bringing up this idea of, what did you say? You said, I think I created a space that people were searching for. And because that's sort of been our experience too when Double Blind creates events, is that, we find that a lot of people give us this feedback of, I go out in the world, like I do the whole thing, I spend the money, I put on the outfit, and I'm just like, why am I here? This is not what I needed after a long week of work. And I know that something you've spent a lot of time thinking about is this concept of third spaces, and that your desire to create intentional raving is also kind of inextricably tied up in your sense that, like, we just need in our culture different kinds of places to gather. Can you talk a little bit about, you spend so much time in clubs and raves and partying and festivals, like, talk to me about this need that you see and, sort of the feedback you get from people when for the first time they come into a space where, like, they don't have to be the who's who. They can just really let go.
Yeah, I think that these days, unfortunately, our lives have become so siloed where we either meet people through work or our attention is being directed through tech algorithms into networks that are not necessarily of our choosing. And so with the closure of third spaces or, clubs, social spaces outside of work and home, there are so few places that you can go to find community in person, in the flesh. And I think community is so important, not just for social life, but for psychedelic and drug use, because for decades, or if not centuries, that is how people did drugs. And it wasn't through going to a clinic. It wasn't through going to a doctor. It was through folk wisdom that was passed down from elders or from people who were very experienced in these substances, telling you, like, okay, this is what we do. This is how we do it. And we're going to do it together. And we're all going to be on the substance at the same time. And this is how you feel safe. And I think that a lot of people are missing those experiences these days. And so I think raves have always been a frontier of drug experimentation. And that's one of the most beautiful things about them. And that's why, I love reporting on them, because I often feel like I'm ahead of the curve a lot of the times when it comes to drug trends, because they hit the raves first. And then I start seeing them elsewhere. But the problem with a lot of raves is that, well, until very recently, there really wasn't much of this idea of harm reduction or of chill out zones, or just what do you do when you get too high? And so what I loved about our party is how many people came up to me and said, I love that. I mean, these people are like experienced drug users, but they're like, I loved when I did too much ketamine by accident, which happens to everyone. We all slip on the banana peel. I could just like run into this little shadowy room and like lay down for a second. And I was like, exactly. Because how many times have I been on the rave way too high and I have nowhere to even sit, much less have someone to talk to and work through my problems with. So Yeah, I think that rave spaces are really important for this reason because they're a form of education. They're a form of social connection that goes beyond the algorithm, as well as beyond like traditional workplace relationships or, the increasingly small silos of social connections that we have these days. I think raves have an element of like beautiful randomness. And at its best, a rave is a place that brings together people from all social classes and all races and all backgrounds. And they're some of the most diverse spaces that you can find. I've met so many people that I would never have been friends with because of my socioeconomic background if it wasn't for raving. And it's opened my mind. It has blown open my mind so many times. And I'm so grateful for that. But I find that a lot of nightlife these days, because of the TikTokification and the social mediaification and the way that everything is so siloed, a lot of parties these days just end up being like really fragmented. And it's just the same crowd of people and the same genre of music. And it's a really predictable experience. And it's become very much about like being cool or being seen and all of these values that are actually antithetical to what the counterculture is supposed to be about. So, yeah, I think that what I am trying to do is to work on a lot of problems that are making me dissatisfied with not just party culture, but life itself. And I think a lot of people feel this sense of like claustrophobia, dissatisfaction, the feeling that there's no way out. The world is ending, everything is fucked, the vibes are bad. What do we do about it? Of course, we can take to the streets, we can go and protest. All of these things are important. But I think that raves are also where people can go to connect, to heal, to touch upon their deepest inner selves and to, sort of ground themselves within community before they go back out into the world. And I think the second part of that sentence is really important. I think it's really important for us to go back into the world with the healing that we get through psychedelics and raving.
I so appreciate you saying that. There's a whole other conversation to be had about spiritual bypassing within the psychedelic community, but
And
we
the rave
firmly
scene.
believe it and the rave scene, but we firmly believe at Double Blind that in the psychedelic community, we talk about integration, which is that time after the psychedelic experience where you're integrating the lessons that you had on the psychedelic into your life. But we talk about integration in phases. There's the personal integration, and then there's the collective integration. So once you find some of that happiness, it's not saying it's going to all happen overnight, but once you start to chip away at the distress and you start to feel some relief and you start to feel some happiness and you start to have more capacity to tend to yourself, then what? Is the end goal? I personally, Shelby Hartman, am going to be super happy and healthy and successful. I'll just, my own values and what I think psychedelics often show us is sort of the interconnectivity of all things. And so there has to be another step after that. And what is that step? Going back out into the world with the healing. Anyway, there's so much more to say about this, but I actually do think this is a really good transition to our final story, which is a story that you reported for us called Companies Are Mailing Patients Ketamine, but Not Everyone is on Board. Now, the reason why I say it's a good transition is because you were talking about the deep importance of community, connecting with others, processing with others. And there are a lot of people all across the United States and the world who are hearing about psychedelics, who are suffering, and who don't know anyone else that does psychedelics, and are deciding to just somehow get access and have these experiences on their own. And I'm not saying you can't have a healing experience by yourself, but there is, a lot to be said, at least anecdotally, about making sure that you're supported before and after. And yeah, having a community to come back into to help process these experiences. And that relates to this story about companies that are mailing patients ketamine, but not everyone is on board because basically what these companies are doing is, like Michelle said, you're having a very short interview with someone over Zoom or on the phone, and then ketamine lozenges show up in your house, and then you're supposed to be doing these with like a loved one or someone who's in your bedroom with you or nearby in case you need water or you need to go to the bathroom. But I mean, no one's making sure that that's happening. And, you know, no one is making sure you have a community to come back into to process the experience once it's over. Anyway, tell us a little bit more about this phenomenon and what you found out in your reporting.
Yeah. So I was really interested in writing this story because, as a longtime ketamine experimenter myself, it blew my mind that these companies were mailing ketamine to people's houses and basically acting as high end drug dealers um, through the mail. And so I decided that I really wanted to understand, okay, what is this really like? What is this really about? So I signed up for two different companies' programs at the same time just to compare the experiences. And, you know, I went through it like a patient. I did the intake forms, I did the pre-screening calls, I had the calls with the prescriber slash therapist. I was prescribed my dosage. I took the lozenges in bed. I did all of the journaling prompts. I listened to the meditations. I listened to the music. And I kind of came to my own conclusions. And it was a really fascinating experience because it was so different from doing ketamine at a party. I mean, the whole protocol is built around what is basically IP. Is these companies are coming up with their own programs for you to do ketamine, and maybe sometimes it comes with like a short therapy call with a, you know, with a nurse or with a therapist. Sometimes it comes with like music and meditations that they've made for their patients specifically. So you're not just paying for the drug a lot of the time, you're also paying for these like boutique sound meditations that they're sending you the links to, along with.
Well, the cost of making the drug, ketamine is not very expensive. So when you're paying hundreds of dollars for lozenges or thousands of dollars for IV and IM in the clinic, you're paying for the access, you're paying for the program, you're paying for the support. If you're in a clinic, you're paying for the space, you're paying for the nurse's time. You're not paying for the ketamine.
Exactly. So I was really actually interested in all of the extra plus that was going into this and whether it was worth sometimes the thousands of dollars that you're paying. So let's be clear that telehealth and mail home ketamine is actually much cheaper than going into a clinic. Going into a clinic, you know, you have to be accompanied by a nurse for the entire duration of the trip, which ends up costing quite a bit. And you have to go in usually for several rounds into the clinic. Whereas with mail home ketamine and the way that these companies are cutting costs is that you're basically self-directed. Sometimes you'll have a call before and after with a therapist. But oftentimes you're just kind of dosing it by yourself. And if you need help, maybe they have someone that you can text. For example, one of the companies had someone that you could text. But yeah, a lot of the ways they're cutting costs is through the lack of service personnel. But at the same time, they're also kind of giving you this at least semblance of support by giving you these screener calls with a therapist before and after. And those I thought, to be very honest, were more of a superficial glimmer of therapy rather than the real thing. I mean, how much can a therapist really get to know you in the space of a 15 to 20 minute or even 30-minute call? It takes a really long time to build a relationship with someone so that you can really uncover some of the trauma that you're working through. And so I definitely found a lot of these calls really perfunctory and felt like I was maybe speaking with more of a life coach than a therapist. So that was one of the things that was kind of eye-opening. Another thing was how easy it was to get prescribed the ketamine. They asked a long, long list of questions that were, I guess, supposed to screen out people who were not good fits for this
Good
therapy.
candidates.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But my question then became, who is supposed to be screened out? Because a lot of the questions were, do you have anxiety? Do you have depression? Do you have problems with attention? Which honestly, almost everyone I know could say yes to. You know, that's a really, really broad spectrum of people who could claim at least tendencies towards anxiety, depression, or ADHD or other conditions. And so later I spoke with some of the founders of these companies and I said, who do you actually screen out? And they would often tell me, oh, it's actually not people with like mild conditions. We're actually trying to make sure that we don't get anyone with suicidal tendencies, because those people, we don't have the support structure in place to really help them. And a lot of the times with ketamine, as we kind of mentioned before, there's this rebound effect where you might feel better for a while, but then if you don't do another session closely after, you can actually get worse and become more suicidal.
And I do want to just flag as well that we don't have data on this necessarily. I know a lot of people who do ketamine, at least in an IV clinic, do report that their symptoms of depression have significantly changed for the better. And that there's, there are cases, I just want to, chime in a little because there are a lot of cases to be made for why we need to be careful with this model, but also one of the big cases for the model, and I'm not saying I support one way or the other, but is the accessibility point, and that the IVs are a round of like 6 IV treatments is around $3,000-4,000, maybe even more dollars, whereas the lozenges are in the hundreds. I want to say like $400 to $600 probably for a batch of lozenges. Still really expensive.
Yeah, usually under 1,000, which is more affordable to most people.
More affordable to some people.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously still much more expensive than buying these drugs on the street. And then the last thing I'll say is that when I actually started doing the lozengers in bed and listening to the sound meditations, first of all, the lozenges taste terrible. Lozenges are actually not the best way to take ketamine. They're not very bioavailable through oral intake, but they are probably the most safe way compared to insufflation or IV or IM. So that's why they're being
on your own.
Right, on your own, exactly. So, that's probably why. And then the music that they provide was awful. It was so bad. I mean, I would have rather listened to a ambient mix on my SoundCloud that was made by a DJ that I really trust than listen to these like really wishy-washy, like new age soundtracks that, I mean, some of them, I'm gonna shout out Mind Bloom. I think that some of their tracks actually were really good. But other companies that I've tried and other clinics that I've been to in person as well, the music is what really kind of brings me out of the experience. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say we got to wrap up this segment soon, but I was gonna tell a funny story of when I went. Actually, last year I tried a round of ketamine infusions in the clinic, and during one of my infusions, they put on this album that sounded like young boys doing like Gregorian chant in the Vatican or something. It's all like, and I'm all call button. She comes in, I'm super high on ketamine, and I'm like, what am I? Change the music, please. Change it. It's horrible. I hate this.
Yeah.
Am I? Oh, no. I remember I was cracking up super high on ketamine, and I said, am I the Pope?
I know, same. Literally same. I almost had to stop. I was just like, I need to go. Like, this is so bad. But okay,
is there a rave down the street? Because I'm out of here.
right. Like, or let me just put on my own music because I know better. But beyond my own personal experiences and disappointments and complaints, I think if you zoom out a little bit, what the story was really about is like, do these companies really know what they're doing, or are they kind of making shit up as they go? How much responsibility are they really putting into the screening process, and the support that they're offering to people? Are these companies ethical, or are a lot of them just VC minded, startups that are trying to make quick cash grabs while the laws are really lax around telehealth and mailing drugs to people at home because it was the pandemic? And are they just trying to make a quick buck off pretty vulnerable populations like veterans and trauma survivors? And is this a sustainable model for the future as the ketamine industry continues to grow and people are starting to research more and getting more acquainted with, its more addictive qualities? It's relatively easy to scam these companies and get a pretty reliable source of ketamine if you really wanted to. They claim that they register all of their patients within a database, which prevents multiple patients hitting up, or sorry, they claim that they register their patients into a database, which prevents the same patient hitting up multiple clinics at the same time. But they don't really check that much about your ID or your background. You could easily lie to somebody and still get around it, I think. So I think that my takeaway from writing this story is that there are a lot of problems with this model, actually. While it does definitely offer a lot of relief to folks, like I also spoke to people who told me that their lives have been saved through at-home ketamine therapy. So I don't want to discount those folks either. But I think that we're still so early in the process, and there's so little government oversight and regulation and standardization of the protocols, not just of the drug, but of the treatment processes around them.
Of the dosage.
Of the music. And so I think that there's a lot of room to grow. And I think that even industry experts themselves are saying that they want more regulation.
Yeah. This is a very complex story, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it unfolds over the next year or so. Now we're going to get into what I think is one of the most interesting and fun parts of the show. We're going to answer some of your questions about psychedelic journeying. We need to provide a quick disclaimer in case you didn't catch on so far during the rest of the conversation. We are not doctors. We are not nurses. We are not shamans. We are not therapists. We are journalists and people that have done a lot of drugs. So yeah, that's my disclaimer, and do with it what you will. Michelle, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So this is a question that I love. It says, I want to try ketamine, but I can't afford to go to a clinic. Same. I've thought about just doing it on my own, or maybe going with one of those telehealth clinics. What do you recommend? Okay, so I think that this is a very interesting question given the whole conversation that we just had. Do I actually recommend going with these telehealth clinics to someone who is a complete beginner? And in this case, I'm of two minds. On one hand, I want to say, yeah, if you have the money, go with these telehealth clinics because they give you so much instruction. Not necessarily from a therapist, but they give you a long document of like, this is exactly what you need to do. And this is step 1, step 2, step 3. They portion out the dosages for you. They give you all the music. You just kind of plug and play, which makes it much easier and perhaps less scary for someone who's never done K. But the more experienced ketamine user in me also says, no, just do it yourself. Do it with a friend who maybe has some experience. Choose your own music, and you'll have a better time and save so much money this way. But I think that if you're going to do it yourself, there's definitely a little bit more work that you have to do on your end. One, obviously, the sourcing is super important. Like, who are you getting the ketamine from? That's often the biggest hurdle, I think, for most people who've never done K, is they have no idea where to get it. And if they do, it's like they don't know if that person can be trusted. So again, that's why the telehealth model is so appealing to people. But
test your drugs.
Yeah, if you do have the chance to get it from a reputable dealer that maybe some of your other friends who do ketamine have gotten it from, the first step is to definitely test your drugs. And the drug paradigm has shifted so much now that we're in the era of fentanyl, and overdoses are something that can happen to anyone. It's no longer just this like kind of scary boogeyman in the corner that could get you if you're like a hardcore junkie. Now it's like, okay, anybody can overdose. It's kind of just this random thing. And by the way, this is like no shade to junkies or fiends. Like, those are often my people too. I'm just saying, like, overdoses have become mundane, which is kind of crazy. So there are a lot of places that you can go to test your drugs. I highly recommend Dance Safe's testing strips. And the way you want to do it to ensure 100% reliability is to actually dissolve the entire bag of drugs into water, which is, again, a lot of work. But once you dissolve ketamine into water, you can actually re-dry it by using heat. And that will actually take away some of the contaminants from the ketamine and help to kind of like, you basically are giving it a wash to purify it. But anyway, the instructions for drug testing you can find on DanceSafe's website to go more into depth with that. And then the second thing is dosing. You probably want to start pretty small. When I did the ketamine lozenges, actually, I did like multiple at a time, which you're not supposed to do. But I did get pretty deep, which some people think is more therapeutic. But I think that low dose ketamine can also be a beautiful experience. And the most important thing, actually, I think is, and according to researchers too, is finding music that really resonates with you. Music is like a really, really big part of the therapeutic journey. And I think a lot of people kind of leave it as an oversight or as a final thought, but it should actually be like a really central part of your experience. So,
100%.
Yeah, finding music that is not going to be too jarring and too random. It's probably better not to have too many voices and to stick to more ambient instrumentals.
Mm-hmm.
But what's also really interesting is like when you look into some of the music theory around psychedelic therapy, oftentimes clinicians recommend a playlist or like a DJ mix or something that has like a journey. So you kind of takes you from a place of like chill, kind of introductory, like an entryway, but then it kind of rises and peaks and you have this sort of like cathartic moment where maybe you're working through something and the music kind of pushes you through it. And then you have a calm down phase of like kind of settling back into your body. So I think it could be a lot of fun actually to like pick songs that kind of follow this arc if you don't have a DJ mix already in mind.
Right. And I'll just say that Double Blind actually does have a Spotify, and we have tripping playlists on our Spotify that are probably better than the telehealth clinics. Probably. So question number 2, I want to trip, but I don't know where to get shrooms. Can you recommend a place? So this is so funny. So we actually had to start putting in our emails, like, don't ask us where to get drugs, because in case you didn't know, we're a media company and we can do a lot of things. Like, we can give you articles, we can give you podcasts, we can make a documentary. Hopefully we will someday. But no, we cannot tell you where to get drugs. Sorry, they're illegal. That would get us into trouble. But I will say that this is a huge problem, right? You said it as well. Like, people want to try these substances because they're hearing about their transformative potential and they literally just don't know where to get them. Sometimes we forget because we're in cities where we're friends with lots of people that do these substances, but there are actually a lot of older people as well in the double blind community, baby boomers who live all across the United States, Canada, and the world, who like maybe are struggling with depression, anxiety, etc. And like, they actually don't know anyone who's doing psychedelics, and they have no idea where to go to get psychedelics. So what I say to these people is, you have a few options. Option number one is, of course, you can buy them on the underground market. But like Michelle said, you want to be really careful about testing your drugs and knowing your source. And even when it comes to something like shrooms, a lot of people think shrooms are shrooms are shrooms. Actually, that's not true. There's more than 200 different kinds of psilocybin containing mushrooms, and some are much stronger than others. So shrooms are not shrooms are not shrooms. You want to ask, like, what's the species? What's the strain? Have you tried them? And also, if you don't want to go the underground route, or you just don't know where to look, then you have some other options too. Firstly, you can grow your own mushrooms at home, which I will say is still federally prohibited, although it's becoming increasingly decriminalized in a number of jurisdictions. And interestingly, psilocybin spores are legal actually in all across the United States, except for in California, Idaho, and Georgia. So that means if you live anywhere in the United States and in Canada, you can order psilocybin spores. They will come to your house, and that is perfectly legal. But technically, once you start growing them, you're not doing something illegal. So FYI. There are a lot of legal retreat centers abroad that some of whom we trust and some of whom we don't trust. And we've written guides about that on Double Blind. And we've written guides about that on Double Blind. But much like ketamine clinics, the problem is that they are prohibitively expensive for a lot of people. You're looking at something that's in the multiple thousands of dollars by the time that you fly to another country, stay at the retreat center, all the rest. So that's, we talked about one of the elephants in the room being, we don't know what the long-term benefits of these substances are. Well, another, elephant in the room is right now it's extremely expensive to do psychedelics in a legal context. And so that's part of why people are just doing them on their own. And prohibition has put us into this situation whereby, people aren't going to stop doing drugs. They're just going to stop. They're not going to be doing them with the support that they need, potentially. Anyway, do you have anything to say about, I can't find shrooms, where do I get them?
Well, I've started noticing a lot of actually cute brands just selling their products online. Obviously, it's still a risk. But I would say it's actually a bigger risk for these brands than for the consumers to buy them, even on the clear web. Again, you want to be careful. You want to maybe vet these brands a little bit more. But I know of at least 2 reputable brands that are just selling it all online. People are not afraid anymore.
Bananas. It's absolutely bananas what's going on the internet with all these brands. So that concludes our trip tips section for this podcast. And I want to thank the folks who sent in their questions. And if you have questions, we want to know what they are. So you can email them to us at magichour@doubleblindmag.com. Michelle, before we wrap, I want to invite you to do a brief meditation with us. As you know, we're all about sort of bringing cerebral analysis into the body and fully processing through the entirety of our beings. So that's sort of the intention behind this meditation, is we've done a lot of yada, 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 and now let's integrate the yada, yada somatically. You up for it?
I would love that.
Hello and welcome. I'm Sky Weaver, resident facilitator at Double Blind. Thank you for being here today. So I welcome you to just be in your space here, perhaps rolling your shoulders back. Nice. And shrugging your shoulders up to your ears. Deep breath in, and on your exhale, drop those shoulders down. Good. You can even wiggle a little bit, right? Meditation doesn't have to be still. Just a single pointed focus. And allowing your right ear to drop to your right shoulder while keeping your left shoulder down. Deep breath to stretch that left side of the neck. That's it. A couple breaths here. Maybe softening the lips and the jaw and the face. Scowly foreheads. Your next inhale, lifting that head up to neutral and bringing the left ear to the left shoulder, stretching the right shoulder blade down. Couple breaths here. Feel free to make sound if that feels good to you. That's it. Next inhale, coming all the way up and taking a moment to take that chin down to your heart. Keeping those shoulder blades down to stretch the whole neck and upper back. Deep breath here. And on your next inhale, rolling that neck up. Wiggle those shoulders. Welcome back to your body, friends. Good to be here with you today.
That was the first time I've ever done a meditation in a podcast live. It was really nice.
Well, yeah, the vision is that when folks are listening or watching, that they're taking a minute as well from their days. We know a lot of times people are listening to podcasts when they're doing errands or in the car. Don't close your eyes when you're in the car. But, and so we hope that we're also encouraging the folks in our community to just start practicing taking time, even if it's 30 seconds or a minute in the middle of the day to drop in and center.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else? I almost feel silly asking this question because there's so much more we could talk about, and hopefully we'll have you back. But is there anything else that you wanted to share in regards to this conversation? Anything else that's sort of just alive for you in terms of your work regarding psychedelics right now?
Well, I think that psychedelic legalization is in a really precarious place right now. I think that there have been incredible gains in the last few years with decrim and in some cases even legalization, not just in America, but all over the world. And what I am noticing is happening now is a backlash against that. And, people in Oregon feeling like it didn't really work out there and they want to repeal the Measure 109. People in Thailand feeling like weed legalization got too out of hand and they want to shut down all of the dispensaries. And I think that kind of corresponds to a right-wing backlash against social liberalization that has been happening with a lot of social justice movements around the world. So I don't want to live in this la-di-da land of fairy tales where we think that just because we've made some gains with, destigmatizing and accelerating the mainstream acceptance of these substances, that we can sit on our laurels and expect the world to become a better place. Because in fact, I think that a lot of these substances are becoming commoditized by the worst types of people, that the same mechanisms of power that have always created inequalities of these worlds are becoming accelerated by psychedelics. And the underground has so much wisdom to offer the world. And that's where I think I'm gonna land, because as someone who has been immersed in underground cultures for most of my adult life, I really believe that a lot of the time we diminish our own wisdom and stigmatize ourselves and are ashamed of our own pleasure. And think that, medical only is like the only way to go. But I think that the world needs a hybrid model. It needs more people to try to fix these problems that right now is being relegated to companies and governments. And yeah, it's a really precarious time. And I think everyone can feel it, that the world could very easily swing to a really bad place. And so I think we all need to be in a state of really heightened awareness right now.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Coming full circle and not clinging on to disproportionate hype, but holding all the truths at once, which is something that we hope psychedelics can do. So on that note, because I know you're going to be writing and thinking and talking on all of this a lot more, hopefully on Double Blind, but also in your other work, where can people find you?
Yeah, so my main platform is my newsletter. It's called Rave New World. It's sort of my little dispatches from global rave and drug cultures from every country that I go to, and I travel quite a bit. I'm actually going to Texas next week to chase some of the Dallas and Texan psychedelic rave underground scene. So that'll be my next post. So yeah, subscribing to my newsletter is definitely the best way to go. I'm also on all the social media channels, but fuck Instagram. I sometimes throw parties, as you know. Might be working on one later this year. We'll see. So yeah, I hope everyone who's listening to this keeps in touch and subscribes to my newsletter.
Subscribe to the newsletter. It's awesome. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Shelby.
Folks, if you want the chance for us to answer your questions on air about tripping, I'm going to remind you that you can send them to magichour@doubleblindmag.com. Either way, we do our best to answer people's questions on Instagram DMs, and we also now have a fancy AI chatbot that we've trained with all the articles on our site that you can ask for trip tips. We also have lots of amazing classes on microdosing and growing mushrooms and all other kinds of things, so you can check those out at doubleblindmag.com. And if you have any thoughts about what we talked about today, you have suggestions about who should come on, there are so many ways to hit us up other than email. We are at doubleblindmag on all channels: TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, you name it. Thanks again to our guest, Michelle Lhooq. You can find her at Michelle Lhooq, Lhooq. We'll also put the link to her Substack in the show notes. I want to give a shout out to the amazing folks at Human Content who are producing this podcast and helping make it possible. They do a lot of great podcasts other than this one, so if you're an audiophile, check them out on Instagram and TikTok at Human Content Pods. Thanks to all of the great listeners for leaving your wonderful feedback and awesome reviews. If you subscribe and comment on your favorite podcasting app or on YouTube, we might give you a shout out. Full video episodes are up every week on YouTube at Double Blind. I'm your host, Shelby Hartman. Thanks again to our correspondent and journalist, Michelle Lhooq. Our executive producers are Aaron Corney, Rob Goldman, Shanti Brooke, and Alex Field from the Double Blind team, who also edits the show. Our engineer is Jason Portizo, and to learn about the Double Blind Magic Hour program disclaimer and ethics policy and submission verification and licensing terms, you can go to doubleblindmag.com/magic-hour or reach us at magichour@doubleblindmag.com with any questions, concerns, inspirational quotes, or puns. Double Blind Magic Hour is a Human Content and Double Blind production. Now let's take you out on Atman by Ksenia Luki and Josh Brill. This is a song that I was first introduced to when sitting in ayahuasca ceremonies, and since then I've met both Ksenia and Josh. They're beautiful human beings, and it's really just become a medicine music classic. Until next time.
I talk to a spirit, she comes in my dreams. She teaches me lessons, and boy does she sing. Her voice sways like a hummingbird, flies like a shooting star. She whispers, you were never born, so you will never die. Every step of the way, remember that you are an infinite soul. Atman,
watching. And if you're thinking, gosh, I really need more Double Blind Magic Hour in my life, well, you can start listening now by clicking on that playlist button right over there. New episodes are out every Monday, so please subscribe and join us each week on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.